Today we're going to talk about one of the darkest and most tragic episodes in the Bible, the story of King David and his sons. You might think that David, a man after God's own heart, had a blessed and harmonious family. But the truth is that his house was the scene of betrayals, murders, and rebellions that stained his lineage forever. Imagine a king who conquered nations but couldn't govern his own house. A father who watched his children destroy each other one by one, paying the price for his own past mistakes. From an adultery that seemed like just another slip-up, a wave of tragedies arose that would transform his legacy into a tale of pain and learning. Prepare to dive into a story filled with desire, revenge, blood, and redemption. David's fall began where he least expected it, within his own home. And what happened afterward was a brutal lesson about the consequences of sin and the mercy of God. But first, do you want to discover more about the mysteries and curiosities of the Bible? Subscribe to our channel now and activate the bell so you don't miss any content. David, king of Israel, let himself be carried away by desire and took Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, for himself. The adultery, however, was not the end, but the beginning of a chain of tragic events. In trying to cover up his sin, he arranged for Uriah's death on the front lines of battle, staining his hands with blood. The prophet Nathan, sent by God, confronted David with an impactful parable, revealing the gravity of his sin. The sentence was clear: the sword would never depart from his house. David, upon hearing such words, fell into deep lamentation, confessing his transgression against the Lord. The consequence of his actions was not long in coming. God himself declared that disorder and violence would plague his descendants. The king who once danced before the ark of the Lord now saw his kingdom falling apart by the very hands of his family. David's sin not only stained his conscience, but also opened the breaches for chaos to take hold within his house. The man after God's own heart found himself vulnerable to the bitter price of his choices, a price that would not be paid only by him, but by his descendants. In the midst of repentance, David cried out for mercy, composing Psalm 51, a cry of supplication and confession. He knew that God is just but also merciful, and therefore he asked for a pure heart and a right spirit before the Lord. However, repentance does not prevent the consequences. The Lord had determined that his family would suffer tribulations. The man who ruled a great kingdom could not prevent his own house from becoming a battlefield. Nathan's words were a warning that evil done in secret would bring judgment in public. David's humiliation would not come from foreigners or enemy armies, but from his own sons who carried his name. And so ruin began to take shape within his house. The mistake of a father became the curse of a house. Sin, like a bitter seed, began to sprout and spread deep roots that would bring pain and destruction. Adultery and murder marked a before and after in the king's life. What began as a momentary desire soon turned into a story of betrayal, blood, and tears. Tragedy became inevitable, but this was only the beginning of the storm that would plague David's house. What was to follow would be even more cruel and painful, a succession of events that would show that the harvest of sin always comes. God's judgment on David manifested immediately and cruelly. The son born from adultery with Bathsheba was afflicted with a mortal illness. David, the strong and warrior king, was reduced to dust before this sentence, crying day and night for divine forgiveness. He fasted, wept, and prostrated himself before the Lord, hoping that his prayer could change the divine decree. However, the answer was silence. His lament echoed through the palace corridors while the child's life slowly faded away, implacable as God's justice. His servants watched with fear, not daring to bring him worse news. On the seventh day, it happened. The child died. But to everyone's amazement, David arose, washed his face, changed his clothes, and went to worship the Lord. Pain did not take him away from God, but brought him closer. When questioned, David replied with words that have traversed the centuries. "I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." His faith transcended loss. He understood that God's discipline was not without purpose, and that eternity would restore what life had taken away. That moment was a turning point. The king who had been broken now prepared to move forward. God, in his sovereignty, allowed a new hope to arise. Bathsheba conceived another son, and he was named Solomon, the chosen one to continue David's legacy. The death of the baby was not just a punishment, but a severe lesson about the consequences of sin. David, who had so often experienced God's favor, now understood that divine holiness does not tolerate disobedience, even in the life of a king. Still, God's mercy was not withdrawn from him. Solomon was born under a new purpose, and the Lord loved him from the womb. The pain that had plagued David's house gave way to the promise of a reign of wisdom and peace, but the shadow of the past still loomed over his lineage. Divine discipline did not destroy David, but molded him. Every tear, every day of mourning, every silent plea was used to sculpt his heart. God restored him, but the scars remained as a reminder that even the chosen ones suffer the consequences of their failures. However, this tragedy was only a prelude to something even darker. Within the palace itself, the sin that David tried to cover up began to poison his family. The king did not imagine that, among his children, horror would manifest in an even more cruel way. The fate of his house was sealed. The justice spoken by Nathan was only beginning to be fulfilled, and soon the violence between brothers would transform his lineage into a battlefield. Within the walls of the palace, a cruel tragedy was unfolding. Amnon, David's firstborn, was overcome by an incestuous and unhealthy passion for his half-sister Tamar. Desire, when fueled by sin, becomes a destructive fire, and Amnon was willing to do anything to satisfy it. Driven by wicked advice, he devised a plan. Pretending to be sick, he asked that Tamar be sent to serve him. Naive and obedient, she went to him without imagining what was about to happen. The prince who should have protected her became her aggressor. In a brutal act, Amnon violated her and soon after rejected her with disdain. The love he claimed to feel turned to hate, for sin never satisfies, it only corrupts. Tamar, desolate, tore her clothes and covered her head with ashes, a symbol of shame and pain. David heard about the crime and was deeply angered, but did nothing to punish his son. The king, who once imposed justice on his enemies, now remained silent in the face of injustice within his own house. His silence was a poison that only strengthened the chaos to come. Tamar's pain found no justice, and impunity caused resentment to grow within David's house. Absalom, Tamar's brother, did not forget what happened. His anger began to simmer silently, becoming a desire for revenge that could not be contained. The violation of Tamar was not just a crime against her body, but against her soul. The culture of the time imposed an unbearable burden on the dishonored woman. The palace, which should have been a place of honor, became her prison and her future, a shadow. The sin that began with David now showed its ramifications. He took another man's wife, and now his own son violated his sister. The king's house was corrupted, and the curse spoken by Nathan continued to be fulfilled with painful finality. David's silence was a fatal mistake. The king who was strong in battles was weak before his own sons. Tamar was forgotten, Amnon remained unpunished, and Absalom nurtured in his heart a hatred that could only be resolved with blood. Tamar's tragedy echoed through the palace corridors, but no one defended her. Justice was denied, and the cycle of sin and violence only deepened. What should have been resolved with discipline and righteousness became an open wound in David's lineage, but revenge was on its way. Absalom would not let the crime go unpunished. He would devise a meticulous plan, and the sword that David tried to avoid would rise again within his own house. The blood that was shed would not go unanswered. Absalom's anger grew like a silent fire. For 2 years, he kept in his heart the desire for justice that his father refused to execute. David's silence was unbearable, and Amnon's impunity only reinforced the certainty that revenge should come at his own hands. Absalom devised a careful plan. He organized a banquet and invited all the king's sons. Pretending reconciliation, he ensured Amnon's presence. The stage was set, and the prince betrayed with smiles the one he had already sentenced to death in his heart. When the wine gladdened the guests, Absalom gave the order. His servants, prepared to obey without question, attacked Amnon and killed him right there. before everyone. Terror spread through the banquet, and the princes fled in panic, fearing they would be next. The news reached David as a fatal blow. The king, who had already lost a son to death, now saw another killed by the hands of his own brother. What began as a hidden sin now became an open judgment, and his family fell apart before his eyes. Absalom, in turn, showed no remorse. To him, Amnon's death was justice. If David would not punish, he would punish. If the king would not act as judge, he himself would execute the sentence. But the price of his revenge was high, and he knew he could no longer remain in Jerusalem. Like Cain after killing Abel, Absalom became a fugitive. He knew that David could not ignore this crime, even though he had ignored Amnon's. His thirst for justice now turned into a sentence of exile, and the prince had to abandon his home. David's heart was torn apart. He loved Absalom, but saw in him the reproduction of his own mistakes. Blood continued to be shed within his house, and he wondered if peace would ever reign again among his children. But Absalom was not just an avenger. Within him grew a hidden ambition, a desire for glory that would strengthen in the years to come. Exile would not make him just a fugitive, but a strategist who would return to Jerusalem not to bow before the king, but to try to usurp his crown. The murder of Amnon was just a first step. Absalom would learn to wait, to manipulate, to win allies. The desire for revenge would soon turn into something bigger, the thirst for the throne. And David, once again, would see the sword rise within his own house. Betrayal was near. The shadow of a coup already loomed over Jerusalem, and Absalom would return not as a repentant son, but as a rebellious prince, determined to take what he believed to be his by right. Absalom fled to Geshur, land of his maternal grandfather, and remained there for 3 years. The prince, who once was the most handsome and beloved of David's sons, now lived as an exile, far from the city he once could have ruled. But he did not see this as an end, only as a pause. During this time, David's heart oscillated between the pain of loss and wounded pride. He loved Absalom, but the wound of fratricide still burned. How could he forgive a son who shed his own brother's blood? And at the same time, how could he bear his absence? Joab, the astute general, sensed the crisis in the king's heart and decided to act. Using the wisdom of a woman from Tekoa, he crafted a story that led David to reflect on his own situation. The king, touched by the fictional plot, finally yielded to the idea of bringing Absalom back. But the return was not a reconciliation. David allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem, but refused to see him. For 2 years, the prince lived in the same city as his father, but was treated like a ghost. He was physically present, but emotionally banished. Anger began to grow again in Absalom. He knew that David was a merciful king, but also knew that his delay in acting could mean perpetual exclusion. He wanted power, influence, and royal favor. Exile within his own city was unacceptable to him. Desperate for attention, Absalom took an extreme action. He ordered the burning of Joab's fields, forcing him to intercede for him with the king. It was a bold gesture, a veiled challenge, a way of saying that he would not accept being forgotten. Joab yielded and brought Absalom before David. Finally, after 5 years of separation, 3 in Geshur and 2 in Jerusalem, father and son reunited. David kissed him as a sign of forgiveness, but this gesture did not erase the rancor that already burned within the prince. Exile molded Absalom in a dangerous way. He was no longer just a resentful son, but a strategist hungry for recognition. He had learned that it was not enough to be loved by the people. It was necessary to manipulate the scenario to conquer what you desired. The reunion between father and son did not bring peace. In Absalom's mind, the throne already began to take shape as a possible goal. And if David did not give him what he deemed to be his by right, he himself would take it. Rebellion was about to be sown. Exile had ended, but the path to the coup d'etat began to be traced in the shadows of the palace. Absalom would not return to be just a prince. He would return to be king. Absalom wasted no time. His return to Jerusalem was not just a reunion with his father, but the beginning of his strategy to take the throne. With charisma and cunning, he began to win the heart of the people, presenting himself as an accessible leader someone who would bring justice where David seemed hesitant. Every day he positioned himself at the entrance of the city and listened to the complaints of the Israelites. With flattering words and seductive promises, he planted the idea that if he were king, he would bring fairer and faster decisions. Thus, little by little, the loyalty of the people was diverted from the true king. His coup was not a sudden explosion, but a meticulously constructed plot. He pretended humility, but plotted greatness. He fueled old resentments of the people, insinuating that David no longer ruled with the same strength as before. The rebellious prince thus became a menacing shadow. After 4 years preparing the ground, Absalom declared his move. He asked permission to go to Hebron under the pretext of fulfilling a vow to the Lord, but his true purpose was to proclaim himself king. Hebron, the city where David had been anointed, now became the cradle of betrayal. With a network of messengers spread throughout Israel, Absalom announced that the kingdom would be handed over to him. The coup was swift and precise. Many followed his call, including influential advisors of David, such as Ahithophel, whose wisdom was considered almost divine. The king could no longer ignore the threat. The news fell upon David like a mortal blow. The same son he had forgiven now expelled him from the throne. The same young man he had loved since birth now became his enemy. Nathan's sword finally pierced the king's heart, and he knew he needed to flee. Without an alternative, David abandoned Jerusalem. The scene was heartbreaking. An aging king, betrayed by his own son, crossing the Kidron Valley barefoot and weeping. Those loyal to him followed, but the feeling of defeat weighed on each one. But David was not finished yet. He knew that, if God willed it, he would restore his throne. Therefore, he did not try to fight at first. He only trusted and prayed, asking that Ahithophel's counsel be frustrated. His army was small, but his faith was permanent and unwavering. While David fled, Absalom triumphantly entered Jerusalem, convinced that his father would not have the strength to react. However, he did not know that a king forged in the desert and tested in wars would never be an easy opponent to overthrow. The conflict was just beginning. Father and son were now on opposite sides of the war, and royal blood was about to be shed once more. Absalom's rebellion was great, but the hand of God was still upon David. David's army reorganized quickly. Although the king was disheartened, his generals did not hesitate to prepare a response to Absalom's betrayal. Joab, experienced and ruthless, knew that the only way to restore the throne was through war. The battle between father and son was inevitable. The confrontation took place in the forest of Ephraim. Absalom's army was numerous, but inexperienced. David's men, forged in battles against Philistines and other enemies, were ready for war. The clash was fierce, and the forces of the rebellious prince began to crumble. Absalom, riding a mule, tried to flee through the forest, but his fate was sealed. As he passed under a large oak, his long hair became entangled in the branches, and the mule kept going, leaving him suspended between heaven and earth, a prince without a throne, without an army, without an exit. Joab received the news and, without hesitation, disobeyed David's order to spare the young man. Brutally, he thrust 3 javelins into Absalom's heart, and his squires finished the job. Thus fell the one who dreamed of the crown, hanging from a tree, a victim of his own ambition. The news reached David like a blade piercing his soul. He could celebrate a victory, but instead he was overcome by an uncontrollable lament. "Absalom, my son, Absalom, would that I had died instead of you." The king did not see a dead traitor, but a lost son. His weeping echoed through the palace, disconcerting his men. They had fought to restore him to the throne, but now saw their king plunged into mourning for the one who tried to destroy him. Joab, angered, warned David. If he did not celebrate the victory, he would lose the loyalty of his warriors. With pain in his heart, David suppressed his tears and reassumed his role as king. The war was won, but the emotional battle within him was far from over. Nathan's sword had cut deeply, and the price of his sins continued to be exacted. Absalom was buried without honors, in a pit in the middle of the forest, without the glory he so desired. His name, which he tried to magnify, was now just a whisper among the dry leaves of the forest. He who rose up against his father ended up as a forgotten man. David's throne was restored, but the void in his heart would never be filled. The tragedy of Absalom was not just the end of a rebel, but the confirmation of the divine judgment that hovered over the house of David. Peace had returned to Jerusalem, but the price had been too high. And even with Absalom dead, David's challenges were not over. Other sons were already watching, other ambitions were moving in the shadows, and the cycle of betrayal and power struggle was still far from over. The news of Absalom's death struck David as a fatal blow. The king, who had faced so many battles, was now waging his greatest war. Not against armies, but against the pain of losing a son. The throne was secure, but his heart was shattered, the palace filled with echoes of his lamentation. "Absalom, my son, Absalom!" The king's weeping pierced the corridors, stifling any celebration. His generals expected a victorious leader, but found a bereaved father. David's sorrow revealed a cruel truth. Political victory did not erase his family defeat. He regained his reign, but lost the son he loved so much. The blood of his own house stained the stones of Jerusalem, and he knew that all that was the fruit of his own mistakes. Joab, ever pragmatic, could not bear to see the king sinking into mourning. He confronted him harshly, saying that his pain dishonored the warriors who risked their lives for him. If David did not come out to thank them, he could lose the support of his own army. David, even crushed by pain, knew that Joab was right. With effort, he arose and resumed his post. But the brilliance of his reign was dimmed. The king who once danced before the ark of the Lord now moved with the weight of tragedy upon his shoulders. The people saw his suffering and murmured. Some wondered if he still had the strength to rule. Others, even in solidarity, feared that his melancholy was a harbinger of difficult times. David's glory was overshadowed, and his heart would never be the same. The relationship between father and son was never restored. The last memory David would have of Absalom was betrayal and war. The forgiveness he might have offered never came in time. Now there remained only belated regret and bitter longing. The scene of David weeping for Absalom would become one of the most striking images of his history. A powerful king, but a father powerless before fate. He who so often conquered giants was now crushed by the weight of his own failures. Mourning became another chapter of his history, but the kingdom would have to move forward. There was a succession to be ensured, and other sons still desired the throne. David had to rise again, for the challenges were not yet over. On the horizon, a new dispute stirred. Another son, Adonijah, began to move behind the scenes, seeking to take advantage of the king's frailty. The struggle for power within the house of David was far from over. As David aged and his strength waned, ambition began to sprout within Adonijah's heart. He was the eldest surviving son, and according to tradition, believed himself to be the natural heir to the throne. But he knew that his father had not officially declared his succession. Arrogantly, Adonijah began to behave as king before his time. He gathered chariots, horsemen, and 50 men who ran before him in a clear display of power. He wanted to be seen by the people as the legitimate ruler, preparing the ground for his coup. History seemed to be repeating itself. Like Absalom before him, Adonijah trusted more in his own cunning than in the will of God. He was surrounded by strategic allies, including Joab, the experienced commander of the army, and the priest Abiathar. But not everyone was with him. The prophet Nathan sensed the danger and acted quickly. Knowing that God had already chosen Solomon as his successor, he chose Bathsheba, the young prince's mother, to alert her. If Adonijah assumed the throne, she and her son would be in grave danger. Bathsheba went to David, who lay on his bed, weakened by age. She reminded the king of the divine promise that Solomon would be his successor. Time was short, and the decision needed to be made before Adonijah consolidated his coup. Meanwhile, Adonijah held a great banquet to celebrate his ascension. Surrounded by allies, he behaved as if he were already the king. But his mistake was ignoring those who really mattered: the prophet Nathan, the priest Zadok, and the warriors loyal to David. David, upon being informed, made a definitive decision. Even weakened, he acted like the king he always had been and ordered that Solomon be anointed immediately. The priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan led the young prince to Gihon, where the sound of the shofar echoed, announcing the new king. The uproar in Jerusalem was enormous. When Adonijah and his followers heard the cries of celebration, they realized that they had lost the dispute even before declaring war. The coup had failed before it began. Fear spread among them. Adonijah fled to the altar of the Lord, clinging to the horns of the altar, pleading for his life. He knew that Solomon now had the power to decide his fate. The throne was consolidated, but the struggle for power within the house of David had not yet come to an end. Adonijah's fate was still in Solomon's hands. But one thing was certain: the throne of Israel was not conquered by force, but by the will of God. And he who tried to take it without divine approval would see his ambition turn to ruin. Adonijah knew that his life hung by a thread. His failed coup placed him before an uncertain destiny. He clung to the horns of the altar, hoping that the holiness of the place would prevent his execution. Before Solomon, he swore submission, and the new king, in an act of mercy, allowed him to live, for now. Solomon began his reign with prudence, but he was not naive. He knew that, while Adonijah was alive, a threat would persist, and it was not long before his brother's ambition manifested again. Adonijah asked to marry Abishag, a young woman who had served David in his final days. This request seemed harmless, but it carried a dangerous insinuation. In Eastern tradition, taking for oneself a woman of the former king was a symbolic gesture of claim to the throne. Solomon sensed the threat behind the proposal and knew that Adonijah had not yet given up on his ambition. Without hesitation, the young king decreed his execution. He ordered Benaiah, commander of his guard, to eliminate Adonijah. The brother who tried to usurp the throne now paid with his own life. Solomon's initial pardon was not enough to contain the fallen prince's ambition. The political cleansing continued. Joab, who had conspired with Adonijah, was also sentenced to death. He fled to the tabernacle and clung to the altar, as Adonijah had done. But Solomon was not moved. Benaiah executed Joab, and the former commander fell amid the sanctuaries. The priest Abiathar, another ally of the coup, was deposed and exiled, thus ending his influence over the kingdom. With these actions, Solomon consolidated his rule, eliminating any shadow of threat. The era of David came to an end, and a new time began in Israel. Solomon's ascension was not marked only by strength, but by wisdom. Unlike his brothers, who sought power by carnal means, he understood that true reign came from God. Therefore, upon assuming the throne, he asked not for riches or glory, but for understanding to govern. The Lord was pleased with his request and granted him unparalleled wisdom. Under his rule, Israel would prosper as never before, and the peace that David never managed to maintain in his house would spread throughout the kingdom. The time of wars and betrayals had ended. Now began the time of construction. The temple of the Lord would be erected, the glory of God would fill Jerusalem, and Solomon would become one of the most celebrated kings in history. But the scars left by the tragedies of the house of David were never erased. The sins of the past still echoed, and the seeds of future destruction were already planted. The lineage of David would continue its course, and from it, one day, would come the King of Kings. But until then, Israel would still face ups and downs, victories and judgments, conquests and falls. The story of David and his sons was an eternal reminder that the grace of God is greater than human errors, but that the consequences of sin never cease to exist. The story of David and his sons is more than a narrative of betrayal and tragedy. It is a reflection of human nature, where the consequences of mistakes extend through generations, and where the mercy of God coexists with implacable justice. David, the chosen king, experienced both divine favor and the weight of his failures. The sin that began in secret brought a bitter harvest to his house. Forbidden desire led to murder. Impunity generated revolt. The king's omission allowed his sons to turn against each other. What could have been a lineage of glory became a cycle of pain, betrayal, and blood. But even amidst chaos, God kept his promise. Solomon ascended the throne, and from the descendants of David came the greatest promise of all, the Messiah. Redemption did not come through the strength of kings, but through the sacrifice of Christ, who brought true peace and restored what sin destroyed. This story teaches us that power without wisdom leads to ruin, that hidden sin will sooner or later take its toll, and that God's mercy is always available to those who repent. David suffered the consequences of his failures, but found grace at the end of his journey. And the great lesson that remains is this: it is not enough to win external battles if the war within the house is lost. True reign begins in the heart, and those who ignore their failures will sooner or later see the price to be paid. Thank you so much for watching this video and for joining us on this beautiful journey through the stories of the Bible. If you felt touched and inspired, subscribe to the channel to receive more content that deepens our faith and spirituality. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and share this video with others who are also seeking divine inspiration. May God bless you.